This is Cris Beswick. I was really lucky. We kind of have a shared connection through Bruno Pesic, who of Playing Lean fame and of various other initiatives, innovation. I saw Cris speak and I asked him to speak, and I'm really grateful that he said yes. He's a fantastic industry expert on, improvement, invention and innovation. And he helps massive companies to get themselves right for the future. So I will leave it to Cris to tell us more. And Cris, I'm going to go away, but I'm obviously here if you need me.
All right. Cheers, Andy. Thanks. So welcome. It is a genuine pleasure to be here. So I'm always really honoured when people ask me to do these things. Does culture really eat strategy for breakfast? And I always put on there "and other musings" because with groups like yours, we always get really cool questions, and those questions tend to take us in directions sometimes away from culture, strategy, and leadership and things like that. So a little bit about me for those of you that don't know. I've been in this space for seems like ages now, probably about 25 years. And I know many of you are looking at the screen now thinking, well, that's impossible because Cris only looks about 30. That's just because I moisturize really well on a daily basis. But I genuinely have been in this space for about 25 years. The first 15 of that, roughly, in the design industry. So I'm originally an industrial designer, was then fortunate enough to build a group of companies. So I was the CEO of a group of design companies for several years. And then about 2010, wrote my first book and transitioned into this space, i.e. the innovation space. And what you'll see from the stuff that I'm going to talk to you about today is my life pretty much revolves around working with CEOs and senior leadership teams and having really difficult conversations about innovation and about the world that we operate in and about how we navigate that world, and about how innovation and building capability, and as you'll see from the title of my last book, a culture of innovation, and how those things help us navigate the VUCA world that we find ourselves in and help us shape the future. I'm really fortunate to run a very small boutique advisory firm with a guy called Dan Toma. If any of you don't know, you can see on screen there. Dan's one of the authors of The Corporate Startup. So between Dan and I, we've written two of the best-selling books on innovation in the past few years. But what I want to start with is this. I want to start with anyone who's in the HR space predominantly will know this phrase, the famous Peter Drucker phrase, "culture eats strategy for breakfast." And I want to frame what I'm going to talk to you about today with the question about whether or not that is still the case, and my thoughts and views and the views of some of the clients I work with on whether or not that is still the case. And I have a personal view, which will culminate at the end of what I'm going to talk to you about. What you will see from all of the slides and all of the things that I'm going to share with you today is everything that I'm going to share is a question. And these questions represent the questions that I have and the questions that I'm asked to help answer by CEOs and senior teams. So every question you see on any slide throughout the next half an hour is a question that has been asked by a CEO or a senior leadership team over the past couple of years. And predominantly between Dan and I, we've helped some of the biggest companies in the world answer these questions and continue to do so. I think it's fair to say that even when we answer these questions, the answer is only contextual and has a time frame to it. And in many cases, we're now going back and re-answering and re-asking some of these questions because they're super important. But I want to start with a slightly light-hearted view on innovation and predominantly on on the subject of innovation theatre, and it's something that really frustrates me. However, that frustration is part of why I'm still passionate about innovation and working with senior teams to drive innovation. The first thing I'm going to do is apologize for the grainy, sort of poor quality nature of this video. I'm desperately trying to find either a higher quality example or a better version of this. But just to kick us off with a little bit of fun, I'm going to overplay a narrative and a script over this video. And as you'll see, it's a video of an unlicensed mixed martial arts tournament, and there's a guy on the left in white shorts who you'll see, who we're going to label the company, the brand, the self-professed innovator. And there's a guy on the right in the black shorts, and we're going to label him, for the purposes of this, we're going to label him the customer, or the recipient of the supposed innovation that the guy in the white shorts claims that he has. So I'm going to play this out now. Hopefully it works. There is some sound, but hopefully you can hear my narrative over it. So hopefully the tech doesn't let us down. So here we go. So the guy in the white shorts is saying, look, everyone, we've got an absolute game changer of a product. Look how amazing it is, right? It's absolutely fantastic. We think it's awesome. Our marketing department have used every possible combination of the word innovation to describe how amazing this product is. And we think we're actually ready to go to market. We've done our research, we've talked to customers, and we're ready to go. So now here's a demonstration of our business model. Look how whizzy it is, look how cool it is, look how awesome it is. That handstand there is a demonstration of our business model. Oh, and we present it to the client, and the client says no. Now that's a tongue-in-cheek example, right, of the kind of theatre that we see in organizations all over the world. I just think it's a really cool little light-hearted way of saying many organizations self-profess their innovativeness. They self-profess that their products, their services, their experiences are genuinely innovative. But rarely do I see organizations that create products and services that are sustainable. And in fact, what I see is the opposite. I see organizations and the clients that I go into who continue to create products and services that aren't sustainable, with brand promises that they haven't and don't stand a chance of delivering against, on products that no one really wants because they're never really close enough to the customer to really unearth proper wants and needs and issues. And predominantly those solutions are priced too high because the cost of getting those products to market is now expensive when innovation isn't done properly. And all of that activity is done and labeled in the name of innovation. And here's another example of innovation theatre, right? And the language that we use around innovation and how we've sort of bastardized the whole value and concept of innovation. The phrase that you see on screen is a requirement that a friend sent me for a job interview for a head of innovation. It was either head of innovation or director of innovation. And one of the requirements was you must be at one with your external radar. I mean, that's the kind of language that just infuriates me. I mean, what is being at one with your external radar? I mean, it sounds like you need to be some kind of Jedi or Yoda or something. So we've got to start being much more pragmatic and real and down to earth about the language we use around innovation, and also about how we approach innovation and how conscious we are about the level of innovation theatre that actually exists in our organization. And the reality is, what we have to do in organizations, and COVID has been a real inflection point on this subject. We have to recognize that we live in a world which is full of wicked problems, and wicked problems. And there's a slide later on about Einstein. You know, wicked problems require wicked solutions. They require demonstrably different approaches. They require demonstrably higher levels of creativity to solve them. And we have to build that muscle as organizations, and no longer can we get away with self-professing we're innovative or labeling what we do innovative if that isn't genuinely the case. This slide here is actually, this is some of the content that we produced in a poll, in a questionnaire that I did with the session with Bruno that was referenced earlier. And I'm not going to read all these out because I'm going to provide everyone with a PDF of the slides anyway, so you can interrogate, these slides at a later date at your leisure and with your teams. But there's still a real richness in terms of the barriers to innovation that exist in organizations. And some of them are big and strategic, and I'm going to talk about some of them in a minute, but some of them are really simple and pragmatic and actually shouldn't really even still exist in organizations. They're so simple to remove. But the reality is we still run organizations where these issues around strategy, leadership, and culture, as we've bucketed them here, still exist. And while they exist, it makes it almost impossible to drive innovation and build innovation capability. So I'm going to split what I want to talk to you about today down to those three things. And the first thing is some thoughts on strategy. And the first thing is, and as I said before, each one of these slides is a question that I've been asked by senior teams, and that in essence we've then helped answer. This question still comes up time and time again. We don't really define innovation, or do we actually genuinely have a definition of innovation? Most organizations I work with now have a definition of innovation, but the definition is valueless. It's pretty useless. It's generally vague, and it's something like you see on screen here. Innovation is about creating or designing something new of value, or something, to that ilk. But as you can see, what's laid out on screen here is that's broadly the definition of invention, not innovation. One of the things that we designed for clients multiple times is definitions of innovation that are actually useful and practical on a daily basis. And I'm going to give you a really quick example of how to do that. For me, a definition of innovation should be something that isn't just a statement that people read once, but becomes a tool that everyone can use throughout the innovation process. And to do that, I use 4 different components. First, the first ingredient is the innovation is the process of introducing something new or different. Now, that doesn't mean that it has to be something that has never existed before. We're not inventing a new element on the periodic table, but it's got to be a new way of doing things or a different way of doing things. The second thing is, does it solve a genuine problem? We're not innovating when we create stuff for the sake of creating stuff. And the third thing, does it add real value to the customer over and above solving the problem that they have? And the fourth ingredient is then, what's our return on investment? So what growth does it drive for us as the creator or the owner or the provider of that solution? And one of the ways that we designed this was to use the value proposition framework. And value proposition is based really around numbers 2 and 3 here. So the first thing is, yes, it's got to be new or different, but is it really interesting? Do customers say, "Ooh, what's that over there? That looks different. That's interesting. I want to find out more," or "Let me go and have a look." So there's got to be something intriguing or interesting about our solution in order that it stands out from everything else. And then number 2 and 3 here are based around the value proposition framework. Have we relieved the customer's pain? And also, secondly, have we also created some gain for the customer? So have we given them something more than just the basic solution? And then the fourth component is, yes, we've got to drive growth and we've got to have ROI, or it's got to deliver the kind of returns depending on the metrics that we're using, but can we do it really, really well? And those are the 4 components. Now, imagine going through your innovation process, and at any stage, when you're validating assumptions or you're at a stage gate or whatever, you can use this definition to sense check and say, look, here's our prototype, or whatever stage we're at. Let's just sense check. Is this really interesting? Is it intriguing? Have we still definitely relieved the pain? Does it add more? Does it create some gain? And are we still able to do this very well? What's the business canvas or the proposition around it, and can we execute it really well? So you can use the very definition of innovation as a tool along the way. What we also get asked quite a lot is how much the human part of the world that we live in needs to be a component of innovation. And I really like this statement by Teek Lenehan from Fjord, which is part of Accenture, so they're a design firm. While there's a variance between frameworks, whether it's outcome-driven innovation, whether it's design thinking, etc., all of those put the user at the center. So they're human-centered in their approach. And what we now know and need to do more than anything, more than we've ever had to do before, is build human-centered organizations. And the beauty about that is when we place humans at the center of that organization, we align that organization itself with the very frameworks and tools we're using to innovate, i.e. design thinking and outcome-driven innovation. We become empathy-driven because we're human-centered and we're human-driven. And the more human-centered we are, the more we can uncover proper problems, and the more we can solve them in a really human-centered way. And a great example of this is understanding user stories, and this is outcome-driven innovation, understanding our jobs to be done, understanding user stories versus job stories. And this is a great example of, the old version of this is, if I asked the customer what they wanted, they'd have asked for a faster horse. This is the contemporary version of that, where if we ask the customer what they want, they try and give us a solution to their problem rather than describing and unpacking the context of their problem. And what we need to do as businesses is get much better at understanding context and situation, and then being able to match that with what the measurement of the solution is to that problem from the customer's perspective. What we also need to do is be mindful that although COVID is a horrible, indiscriminate virus, and the pandemic that we're in is not something that any of us wanted, through adversity and through situations like this, history has shown us that we've created great organizations, and organizations have done great things. And we've seen great evidence of that from organizations throughout the past 6, 7, 8, 9 months, where they've showed real ingenuity, real resolve, and real creativity in how they've either approached dealing with COVID or how they've responded to it. And the previous, not pandemic, but business challenge, the recession post 2008, has demonstrated that organizations that have come out of that have doubled down on innovation and have really focused on it, have reaped the benefits compared to organizations that have hunkered down and not capitalized on how innovative they could be. And there's some examples there of billion-dollar businesses that have emerged, Phoenix-esque out of the ashes of Lehman Brothers crash. The reason they did that is that they've taken a very different approach to strategy, and the approach to strategy is something that we teach senior leaders, and it's about looking much further into the future than we've traditionally looked at strategy before. And typically strategies look from today outwards or forwards. What we now have to do is look at strategy from the future back. We need to look much further ahead for our organizations. Difficult, I know, at the moment, because there's so much uncertainty. That whole VUCA analogy is even more prominent now, that uncertain nature of the world we operate in. But we have to work really hard at looking much further into the future and trying to hypothesize about what may or could or will happen in the near, medium, and long-term future. So strategy now is hypothesis driven, and it's about starting from the future and making really bold ambitions and choices about where we want our organizations to be and how we want them to operate. And then reverse engineering back to today and pushing forward against that future point, but in a hypothesis driven way. So combining a human-centered nature with the hypothesis about how far into the future can we honestly predict is stable enough for us to push forward. And at any given time, if we feel that things have shifted, then we stop and we take stock and we reevaluate that hypothesis around another time frame, whether that's 3, 6, 9, 12 months, whatever it is, and we move forward against that time frame, and we keep iterating that hypothesis-driven nature. So I want to share some thoughts now on leadership, and this is one of the things that's closest to my heart, because the majority of work that I personally do is around helping senior teams, what I call lead for innovation. And that means not necessarily becoming the innovators, but becoming leaders who understand how to own the innovation agenda. And I'll share something with you about ownership in a minute, but understand how to drive the innovation agenda and what it takes and the kind of culture and environment that promotes and inspires contribution to innovation. And the first thing I'd like to share with you is, if we as leaders continue to look at the world as volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, the decisions we make and even the way that we communicate and the way that we present those decisions and the obviousness about our view about the world and how uncertain and scary it is, that's seen by everyone and it's felt by everyone, and the people that we lead pick up on that. Our job as leaders is to transcend beyond that and paint a very different picture about the world, and one that inspires people to want to contribute, that shows people the future is brighter than the situation we are today, and it gives people that purpose that we need to deliver against and deliver. So the first thing is, we have to really understand how much we overvalue what we currently do or what we did yesterday, and how much that's holding us back from driving towards tomorrow. The first ingredient to that is purpose. And as Elon Musk really eloquently said, you know, in a real honest and down-to-earth way, if what I was doing was just about the money, I'd have just started another internet company. I'd have just started another PayPal, because I'd be far richer than I am today. But what Elon has is a massive sense of purpose, and one that's much bigger than most of us can comprehend. And Martin Luther King is probably one of the most famous examples of being purpose-driven, with his whole "I have a dream" speech and his outlook on what he wanted to create and the future that he knew was possible. And language is also really key. So this is Sam Walton, who founded Walmart. And if you look at the language here, our goal is to have customer service that's not just the best, but legendary. Now, language is a massive component of how we lead, and it's really important in terms of the context we provide and how inspiring and how authentic that inspiration is. And what we need to do as leaders is really grasp language and understand the importance of it, especially in the context of innovation. And we all know Einstein said, we can't solve problems with the same kind of thinking that created them. We also know that creativity is a really core component of how CEOs and senior leaders see their ability to succeed in the future. So one of the frameworks that we work with, and a lot of the work that I do around helping leaders lead for innovation, is this. And I refer to it as being a little bit more Martin Luther King and a little bit more Einstein. And this answers the question of, what should leading for innovation really look like, Chris? What do you think we as leaders should really do, and how we should lead? And I think it's a combination of much more increased purpose, doubling down on purpose, and not necessarily being creative, but understanding creativity in a strategic context. And as you'll see in the little bubble there, my view is that purpose and creativity makes people more curious. And when they're curious, it turns people into explorers. It makes them ask questions. It makes them question the status quo. And it makes them want to go and explore and challenge and experiment in different ways. That's what we want leaders to either do or enable their organizations to do. So I summarize that really by saying, the leaders that I work with, my job is to turn them from looking at the world as volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and help them become leaders that are demonstrably and evidently visionary, unbounded, creative, and most of all, authentic. So the final section, I want to talk to you about culture. And again, this is close to my heart, because the last book that I read became a bestseller, I think, because it was a real focus on how we build innovation into organizational culture. I'm not going to go through this slide, but have a look on the World Economic Forum and the research they've done into outgoing skills and the growing requirement for developing the skills that you see on the right-hand side of that slide. When you look at them, you'll see that almost all of them are segues and are absolute core ingredients of innovation and of leading in the way that I've just outlined. Critical thinking, social influence, emotional intelligence, problem solving, analysis, creativity and originality. All of those things are exactly the kinds of ingredients that we need to move from and towards. The challenge we face with organizational culture is very often actions don't match words. So here's some stats from some recent surveys and reports that we pulled together. And even today, even though we know innovation is incredibly important, we still see 75% of leaders believing from their perspective that they have the right culture for innovation, but only 37% of employees agree. And we see, over half of the organizations surveyed globally still don't have a formal innovation process. So they want innovation, they need it, and it still may actually be taking place, but there's no formal way to scale it and capitalize on it and properly derive value from it. And the majority of innovation, because it's not channeled right and it's not managed right from a portfolio perspective, and also that it's not positioned right, most innovation is still incremental, or continuous improvement is another word, or in our language, most innovation is still focused on exploiting what the company already does or has, rather than exploring what the company could do or could become. And the challenge around that from a leadership perspective is, and I have this conversation a lot with leaders. One of the challenges about leading for innovation is that the majority of leaders haven't been prepared to lead for innovation. And what I mean by that is the majority of senior execs all over the world and in many, many companies that we would all know and love, brand names that we would expect, have got fantastic leadership. They have, but not in the context of innovation. And predominantly that's because leadership development and training and coaching of senior leaders for many, many years has been outdated with the world that we operate in. And what I mean by that is most leadership programs still focus on generic leadership. And the majority of leaders I've worked with have had huge amounts of money spent on their development as leaders, and they're brilliant individuals, passionate, brilliant people, great leaders in the context of generic leadership. But what that curriculum and what they've never been taught how to do on all of the programs they've been on, all of the business schools that they've been to, the proportion of teaching them to lead for innovation is very, very, very small. Yet senior managers and key stakeholders and team leaders and senior leaders are thrust into this position of, we need innovation, we need you to lead for innovation. And the reality is we need to do a better job of helping our leaders and our senior executives lead in the way that organizations need. One of the challenges is what that looks and feels like. So if you look at most organizations, they don't really define innovation properly. They don't have a strategy for innovation that's aligned to purpose and the corporate growth strategy. Therefore, it becomes really difficult to understand what your leadership responsibility is and then define the right outcomes, both for you as a leader and for the organization. And then if you take the personal side of that, well, how does leading in that way affect my ego? How does leading in that way affect my status in the organization? Aren't I supposed to have the answers and be the person that is the most, the cleverest person in the room and the most experienced and the person that people come to answer these challenges and problems? Isn't that supposed to be me? So it's vulnerable, and I feel vulnerable when I have to say, or when I feel I need to say, I'm sorry, team, I don't have the answer. What do you think? We have to do a better job of helping our senior leaders lead in that way. And one of the frameworks I created a few years ago for a CEO and a leadership team that asked that very question. So how do we actually lead then so innovation can thrive? And how do we lead in a different way? And what do the people in our organization need? And one of the things we created was this, and we call it the ODC framework. And it's based around the principle that leaders should own the innovation agenda. They don't necessarily need to be the innovators, but they should absolutely own the innovation agenda. Managers in, i.e. the middle of the organization, and that includes influencers, stakeholders, team leaders, etc. They should be enabled to be able to drive innovation on a daily basis, bring it alive and make it happen as part of the day-to-day. And then everyone else, employees, people, should then be enabled and able to contribute to innovation if they want to. That contribution has to be what I call a willing contribution. This whole nature of innovation is everyone's job, quite frankly, is just wrong. Not everyone will be an innovator, but everyone can contribute to the innovation agenda, and we can contribute as individuals in different ways. What's then important is to understand the physical things that need to be in place, and those physical things are different for leaders, managers, and people, and then the psychological things that need to be in place. And again, they're different for leaders, managers, and people. So physical things are innovation strategy, definition, an innovation thesis that guides where you will look for innovation, how you will look for it, what you will invest in, what you won't invest in. Maybe a venture board, certainly a budget, an innovation process and framework, etc. And then the psychological things are, how do we deal with risk in our organization? What happens if I fail when I try to do something? So psychological safety, etc. And unless we address all of those components, something will always be missing in the organization, and the system by which we try and lead in and try and drive innovation in won't be complete and therefore won't function effectively. The final couple of things I want to leave you with is, above all else, innovation is a human thing. As human beings, as people, we are fundamentally built to collaborate physically with other people in the room. Creativity demands really that we do that in the proximity of others. When we're in the room with people and not a virtual room, whether it's Zoom or a platform like this, we interact with people differently. We converse with them differently. Our side hustles are different. We riff off people in a different way. We hear things and we see things that we wouldn't ordinarily do when we're in a Zoom room or when we're in a little side chat room. And innovation thrives off that collaborative physical nature and that different energy and even the chemical change that is elicited when people work together and interact. The challenge we have now is how we migrate through that in the COVID-driven environment that we're in. And one of the things I think we'll see is this return to work, as we're calling it, or the new norm, which I don't think there will ever be a new norm. The world changes on a daily basis. You know, the new norm almost is something that can't ever exist. But what I think will happen is our office spaces will become less about where we go to work and more about being collaborative innovation team spaces, where gone are the days where you can't get a meeting room in head office because there aren't enough. We're going to see conversions of those spaces into innovation hubs and innovation centers where for the broad part we'll work from home, but when we really want to collaborate on solving one of those wicked problems, we'll have somewhere to go and somewhere to work, and we'll have a dedicated space where we can stick post-it notes up on the wall and we can build prototypes and we can solve complex wicked problems. So I think inspiration and that environment is really important. You know, Zoom doesn't always cut it, although it's a fantastic platform, but I still think physical space rules when it comes to creativity and innovation. So I want to leave you with three really, really important questions, and these are sort of the culmination of what I've talked you through. These are three questions that predominantly we help senior teams or I work with senior teams to answer. And these are really reflective questions that if you're a leader, if you're on this call and you're a leader, ask these questions of yourself and your senior team. If you're on this call and you are an employee or a manager, think about these questions in the context of your leaders and maybe present them to them and ask them to ask these questions of themselves. And the first one is, corporate innovation capability is a choice. We choose, and we must choose to build that capability, to build the system, to build the ecosystem, and to build the kind of culture that innovation requires. Therefore, that choice has to be a conscious leadership decision. The leadership of an organization needs to consciously say, this capability is fundamentally important to our survival and even indeed how we're going to thrive. So the question is whether leaders are consciously designing that future, or whether actually they are subconsciously maintaining the status quo. So the question for leaders is, as leaders, what are you currently choosing to do? Like consciously choosing to do? Are you choosing to sideline innovation, or maybe pay it lip service, or maybe actually put it down the strategic list because you don't understand it well enough, you don't think it has value, you think it's going to detract from core business, etc. What's holding you back from doubling down on innovation? The second question is that strategy, whether it's corporate strategy or innovation strategy, is about the pursuit of better. It's about taking the organization as it is today and saying, here's the strategy for where we want to go in the future and what we want to become. And purpose is the same thing, right? Purpose is about saying, here's what exists today, and I think my purpose is to make what exists today better for tomorrow, or to create a different future that we can all live into. So the leadership question is, first and foremost, do we have an innovation strategy? And I mean a proper strategy, not one slide on a PowerPoint presentation, a proper, robust strategy that outlines how you'll innovate, where you'll innovate, how it's going to work, what the venture board looks like, what the budget and funding for it is, what the tools and process and frameworks are, and then how that will be embedded into culture, how you'll lead for innovation, and what the culture needs to be to scale that capability. So do you have an innovation strategy, and have you doubled down on that purpose? And are those two things aligned? i.e., when you start to innovate, will it be purpose-driven innovation? And the third question is, we cannot influence results. No matter how much we want to be able to as leaders, we can't influence results. What we can influence is the behavior and the actions and the processes which deliver those results. So the outcomes that we want are driven by behavior and process, and that's in turn driven by strategy and what we consciously choose to pursue. So the final question is, will our current leadership approach, as how we lead as leaders, get us to the future? Will the culture that we currently have in our organization allow us and enable us to innovate enough and to the right level and to create enough value to allow us to shape the future and become the organization that we want to be? And if you, depending on your answers to those three questions, depends then on, as leaders, what you choose to do. So I started with Drucker's quote around, does culture eat strategy for breakfast? And I think maybe pre-Lehman Brothers 10, 15 years ago, that was true. When broadly the world was linear and much more predictable, if you had several companies that were all competing in a market with broadly similar products and similar propositions and similar price points, then the culture of an organization fed into and was evident when customers interacted with your organization. It was evident when people worked for your organization. So culture probably did eat strategy for breakfast. However, my parting gift is, I don't think that resonates enough, and that is enough in the world that we operate in today. I think if you want to shape the future, strategy, leadership, and culture to play on Drucker's quote, I think strategy, leadership, and culture now need to eat breakfast together. We need to build systems around innovation where the strategy for innovation, how we lead for innovation, and how we build a culture of innovation are all intertwined into one cohesive strategy or roadmap for the future. The caveat that I'll leave you with, though, is in order to do that, and in order to solve wicked problems, those wicked solutions need us to be a little bit crazy. But a little bit crazy is and means not going as far as being batshit crazy. So I'll leave you with that thought. Craziness is good, but too much craziness is potentially damaging. And I'll leave you with that thought. I'm going to open up for questions now. I'm going to end the slideshow, and hopefully technology won't let me down. Everyone can see me again, and everyone can still hear me, and we're open for questions.
Yeah, you still are sharing your slides there, Chris.
Right.
But you can unshare the
Let
screen.
me.
But to be honest, yeah, that's brilliant.
There we go.
Brilliant, mate.
Superb.
I don't know whether you have heard anything about the Trump's debate, the American presidency debates yesterday, but that last slide really resonated even more in terms of batshit crazy. God,
yeah,
scary the way the world is.
It doesn't go. So I did a keynote to a largely US audience the other day, and I just had to check with the organizers that last slide was okay, because obviously the audience could have been filled with one group of people, and it also could have been filled with another group of people. So it's tongue in cheek. He's a target for slides like that. But the point is, we have to be crazy. We have to be bold. We have to be willing to take risks and put ourselves out there. But we've got to balance it with being. It's the difference between what I call smart risk and cavalier risk.
Yeah.
We've got to be smart, not cavalier.
There was a question earlier. I don't know whether this is the same question. So two questions then. First one was when you were talking about companies being very hypothesis driven. Have you got any examples of great companies doing that right now? You know, really driving forward and looking at the future and following the methodology really, really well.
Yeah. So one of the best examples is Amazon and Netflix are two of the best examples, and I don't cite them for the same reason most people cite them, just because their financial valuation is through the roof. But Netflix has a process which absolutely capitalizes on that. One of the interesting things about Amazon, though, is their approach to leadership is aligned with what I showed you on that last slide. There's absolute ownership of an autonomy for that innovation agenda. So the permission space to go and try stuff, to try and validate those assumptions. So they're building hypotheses all the time, but the permission space at leadership level to just go and validate those assumptions is there. It's just implicit. And it's almost the opposite of most organizations, where there's a question about why aren't you doing this? It's actually part of your role, not your role as a leader is and you're allowed to do it. It's no, this is like, you should be doing this, not you can if you want to. So those are two really great examples. The challenge with questions like this is it's really difficult to give people detail, because if you're on the inside, right, then giving people detail about how they do that is quite easy. But sharing detail about their framework for doing that is not possible on an open call like this. And finding information out about them on Google and things like that, it's not widely available information, and quite rightly so, because they've got it right. But they're two really, really good examples.
Yeah, I'm sure you're signed up to some watertight non-disclosure agreements.
Yeah,
second question, what role does data play in innovation?
that's a really good question, and I'll give you two perspectives on that. We and I think you've got a link in the event space. We have a tool called AIM, which is short for the Assessment for Innovation Maturity. And when we talk about culture and building that organization-wide capability, one of the first things that we'll do with a client is run AIM. And AIM is basically, it's an assessment for the combination of capability and how embedded that capability is into culture. And the combination of those two things gives us the maturity level of an organization. The interventions that we'll do with a client are based on that data. So the role that data plays in innovation is to take away subjectivity. Like, I developed AIM about 4 years ago to remove subjectivity from interventions, i.e. clients coming to us saying, Chris, you know, we've spent $2 million with one of the big, big consulting firms. We've got nowhere. We've got an accelerator, but we've got no ROI. Like, we haven't got the culture of innovation we were promised. Like, what do we do and how do we figure it out? And what you then have is you have the senior leaders say, well, I think this is the issue. And, the issue is middle managers and they just don't get it and they're not driving innovation. And the other issue is, our people just don't want to contribute. There's someone always has a view on what the problem is. Data cuts through that subjectivity, right? And it gets us to the crunch of, I'm sorry, Mr. Leaders, but it appears that all the data we've gathered, it appears that you're the problem, right? You're the blocker, for example, or you said you had a strategy, but none of your employees have ever seen it. That's the hard and fast data. It's categoric. It's not subjective, and data plays. So that's how we use data to assess where an organization is at the minute, how we then build interventions to migrate them away from that. But also data is important in the innovation process. The one thing that we have to be careful of is what data we're gathering and what it tells us. Because it's easy to gather data. It's not easy to gather the right kind of data in the right way that informs us in a way that allows us to understand something. And what I mean by that is, I had a conversation the other day about insight. So data, insight, sometimes they're linked together. One of the things we need to understand is, the best way to describe it is, the CIA in America isn't called the Central Insight Agency or the Central Data Agency. It's called the Central Intelligence Agency. The equivalent in the UK is called the Intelligence Service, not the Insight Service. What we have to understand is the difference between data and insight and then intelligence. What we typically do is we try and act on data, but call it insight. We have to understand the difference between insight and intelligence. And intelligence broadly is the actionable use of insight. What that means is we've got to get much better at gathering data, much better at gathering insight, and then much better at turning it into intelligence as organizations. And that starts with gathering data. So it's a good question.
Yeah, brilliant. And I love that, taking away the subjectivity as well. It's very much, with my other hat on, with the We Are Lean and Agile, the improvement software we do, one of the key differentiators between that and process mapping tools is that we're actually giving people the times and costs related to the process. So we don't end up with a pretty picture and then some ideas and we go back to subjectivity. We're actually able to model and understand the costs. And then when you start to challenge and improve it, you can do that with the numbers backing it up. So from a personal perspective, mate, what role does continuous improvement play in creating a platform for innovation? Do you see them as linked? Is it important?
Yeah. So let me define it in the language we use. So we talk about exploitation and then exploration. And one of the challenges with building a culture of innovation is the initial perception is, or the view is, that that's all encompassing. The reality is, in every organization, and it goes back to the thing I talked about before, innovation is everyone's job. Well, no, it's not actually. Contributing to innovation and enabling innovation to be part of how the organization works on a daily basis, that's part of everyone's job. But we don't want everyone to be the kind of innovators that most organizations talk about. What I mean by that is, there's this narrative that a lot of corporates push out there that, well, everyone should be innovating. Well, most people actually on a daily basis are. The challenge is that organizations don't categorize innovation. So they don't consider continuous improvement or incremental innovation as innovation. They just say, well, that's business as usual. We're doing that anyway. We need more. So one of the challenges is you polarize people's understanding of what innovation is, because they say, well, I'm already doing those things. I suggest ideas, and we tweaked that thing last week. Well, if that's not innovation, then the organization, when it asks for it, must mean something much bigger, right? Must mean they want me to be disruptive or radical, because that's the other word that gets thrown around. Well, I can't contribute to that. Those I don't have ideas of that scale. Therefore, I can't. Innovation's not for me. And the reality is, incremental or continuous improvement is, in our language, that's exploitation, right? That's how do we exploit what we currently have and improve it and tweak it and hone it and refine it and make it better. That's still innovation, but on the scale, just trying to get my hands in view, on the scale it's here versus radicals up here, right? But it's all on a scale. And then we then talk about exploration, which on that scale is sort of here, or what we call differentiated innovation, right? What you tend to find is organizations they aspire to being up here. They want radical and disruption, right? And they're not even very good at this bit, yet they want to be radical, right? So what we teach them is a middle ground, what we call differentiated innovation, which is purely around being customer focused and human centric. What that does is it gives us two categorizations of innovation. It gives us exploration, which is incremental or continuous improvement. And then it gives us differentiated innovation, which is exploration. How do we go out and find stuff and do stuff that isn't business as usual? What we tend to find is exploration starts to deliver some of the disruption. But if you go and look for disruption, you very rarely find it. So it's really important, because you don't want an organization that's full of explorers. Some people don't want to do that. They just want to do their job, and they're happy contributing and enabling other people to go and explore. So you have to have a balance of some of your workforce being exploiters and some of them being explorers.
And I tend to find as well that the process of doing the continuous improvement work then throws up ideas for exploration, because you don't just look at your own processes. You start to consider, the needs of the customer and how are we delivering, and is this model even right? Is it right anymore? And what could we think about doing? So it does throw it out there. What's your thoughts to applying this same thinking to public sector? We work a lot in the public sector, the NHS, government, local authorities, who are all doing lots of things. And big challenge in there is always it's the Daily Mail test, really. The last thing they want to do, you can end up on the front page of the papers for one mistake. So there's a lot of risk aversion in there. And how can we create and unlock that culture of innovation in our public sector services? And I'm not saying it doesn't happen.
No,
I'm certainly saying it's probably not in that embedded or set up in a way. It's happening in pockets and guerrilla sort of projects.
So I might take the fifth on this one. And this is and I'll give you some context. it's a massive challenge because, so let me give you context, and then I'll give you a Cris Beswick covering his backside answer. So I'm in very detailed conversations with the Home Office about this question, about how we completely how do we approach leadership across government, across across essential services, etc., etc. And the segue from leadership is then culture, and how do leaders create the kind of culture that we need across the public sector. There's some specific parts of government that we'll focus on initially, but it is a big challenge. It's not insurmountable. It's just going to be a lot of hard work, and it's going to take time. But the reality is we don't have a choice about addressing leadership and culture across government and across the Home Office and essential services, etc., etc. So we don't have a choice. The challenge with government, as you know, is the complex nature by which it makes decisions to take action, and by the differing agendas that are in play one week and then usurped the next week. So the conversation is ongoing, but I think over the next couple of years, I'm confident the right people are in the right roles, in the right parts of government to that something will be done to address this subject, and that's as much as I'll say.
Fair play, mate. I'm really pleased they've got someone like you helping on these challenges.
Well, they haven't yet. That's part of the conversation, but
yeah.
But conversations are happening about how government addresses that challenge. It's not an easy challenge to address. It's not going to be a quick one to address. It's complicated, but what gives me hope is the conversations are being had.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. So with the absence of anyone raising a hand, which I'm not seeing at the moment, I'm going to say massive thanks to Cris, and just confirm we are going to send resources out. So as soon as the video's ready, I will send a resource pack to all people who are registered. So we did have a lot of public sector people. I was actually troubleshooting a little problem early on, and the problem was for one of our potential attendees, they were on Windows 7. So, it's been a while since I've had that one, but yeah, it's, we have some work to do in terms of enabling our people sometimes, but thank you so much, Cris. I think that's been brilliant. And I've seen the comments, and if you've got 5-10 minutes to stop around, I know a few people had to go, but we've still got some people in the room, so we'll drop back to the tables. And
people... I don't have to go anywhere, so if anyone does want to throw any more questions, I'm glad. I've just seen, I think Carl was feeling a little bit despondent, but we seem to have raised his hopes a little bit with his last comment, so that's good.
Yeah, well, Carl's actually doing some really good stuff up there, so don't be despondent, Carl.
I just can't tell you how long the tunnel is, Carl, that's all.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, let's drop back to the floor, and thank you again, Cris. And
my pleasure.
The room's open till 2, longer if people wanted to stop around and carry on conversations, but I know Chris's time is incredibly.
I've got a hard stop at 2.
Yeah, no worries. So we'll drop back. Thanks everyone, and thank you, Cris.